Imagine this: you sit down and eat a full meal, rice, meat, maybe something sweet at the end. At first, nothing unusual happens. You continue talking, scrolling, or thinking just as before. But then slowly something begins to shift. It's subtle enough that you might not notice it immediately. Your eyelids start to feel heavier, not dramatically, just enough to make blinking feel slightly longer than usual. Your thoughts lose a bit of their sharpness. The world doesn't disappear, but it becomes less urgent, less demanding. It feels almost as if someone quietly turned down the brightness and contrast of your awareness. Most people shrug this off and say, "That's just sleepiness." But that explanation is more of a label than an understanding. It's like pointing at a moving car and saying, "That's motion," without asking what's actually causing it. The real question is far more interesting, and a bit uncomfortable if you follow it seriously. Why would a body designed to survive, to stay alert to danger, to react quickly to the environment, choose this exact moment, right after receiving energy, to become slower and less alert? If food is fuel, then logically you might expect the system to speed up, to become more active, more awake. But instead, the opposite happens. That contradiction is the starting point. To understand it, you have to stop thinking of your body as a simple machine that just runs on food. It's not a car where fuel goes in and motion comes out. It's closer to a city, an organized, constantly negotiating system where different parts have competing needs. Energy doesn't just get used. It gets distributed, redirected, and sometimes withheld from certain processes so that others can function. When you eat, something significant changes inside that system. The food doesn't instantly become usable energy. It arrives as raw material, complex, disorganized, and in many ways unusable in its current form. Your body now has to break it down, sort it, analyze it, and decide what to do with each component. That process is not passive. It's active, structured, and surprisingly expensive in terms of energy. So while you experience a simple act, eating, your body experiences something closer to an internal event. A shift in priorities begins. Resources start moving. Blood flow changes direction. Chemical signals start spreading. Entire systems that were relatively quiet suddenly become dominant. From your perspective, nothing dramatic is visible. You're just sitting there. But internally, it's more like a quiet reorganization where certain functions are given priority and others are gently pushed into the background. And that is where the strange feeling begins, because your conscious experience is tied closely to certain functions. Attention, alertness, fast thinking. When those functions are slightly reduced, even if everything else is working harder than before, it feels like a loss. It feels like something is turning off, but what's actually happening is not a shutdown. It's a shift. A shift that reveals something subtle about how your body really works. It cannot maximize everything at the same time. Even with all its complexity, it still has limits. And every time you eat, those limits become visible. Not through what speeds up, but through what temporarily slows down. Now imagine that same situation, but zoomed out into something easier to picture. Think of a large city in the middle of a normal day. Cars are moving, people are working, messages are being sent, decisions are being made. Everything is balanced, not perfect, but stable. Then suddenly thousands of heavy trucks begin entering the city all at once, each carrying raw materials, wood, steel, fuel, food. At first, nothing collapses, but the system starts to adjust. Traffic slows. Certain roads become congested. Some areas that were previously active become quieter because resources, space, attention, coordination are being redirected to handle the incoming load. The city doesn't shut down, but it changes its priorities in real time. This is a useful way to think about what happens inside your body after you eat. Food entering your system is like those trucks arriving all at once. It's not immediately useful in the form it arrives. It has to be processed, broken down, sorted, and distributed. And to do that, your body needs to reorganize how it uses its internal infrastructure. One of the first major changes is in blood flow. Blood is not just moving randomly through your body. It's being constantly directed based on need. After a meal, a significant portion of blood is redirected toward your digestive organs, your stomach, intestines, liver, and pancreas. These areas become temporarily more active, more supplied, more prioritized. But here's the important constraint. The total amount of blood, and more importantly, the energy it carries, is limited. So if more is going to digestion, relatively less is available for other systems, at least for a period of time. This doesn't mean your brain is being turned off. That would be dangerous and evolution wouldn't allow it. But it does mean your brain is no longer operating in its highest alert, most energy-demanding mode. It's being slightly deprioritized in favor of something more immediate, processing what you just consumed. Now consider what digestion actually involves. Your stomach begins secreting acids strong enough to break apart complex structures in food. Your pancreas releases enzymes that target proteins, fats, and carbohydrates, each requiring a different chemical strategy. Your intestines begin a coordinated movement, slowly pushing food along while extracting nutrients through an enormous surface area folded inside you. At the same time, your liver acts like a sorting center. It receives nutrients and decides what to store, what to release into the bloodstream, and what to convert into other forms. All of this is happening simultaneously, and none of it is free. Every chemical reaction requires energy. Every movement of muscle in your digestive tract requires energy. Every decision your liver makes at a cellular level requires energy. So the system does something very logical. Even if it feels strange from the inside, it reallocates. Instead of spreading energy evenly across all functions, it concentrates energy where it is most needed at that moment. From an outside perspective, this is efficient. From your conscious perspective, it feels like something is being taken away. Your thoughts may feel slightly slower, not because the brain lacks the ability to think, but because it is operating under a different set of priorities. Your body may feel heavier, not because it has suddenly become weaker, but because resources are being directed elsewhere. This is the hidden trade-off. The body cannot treat every moment as equally important for every function. It has to choose. And after a meal, the choice is clear. Invest in processing and storing energy now, even if it means temporarily reducing outward performance. What feels like a small dip in alertness is actually the visible edge of a much larger internal decision. One that your body makes automatically, without asking every single time you eat. Now shift attention from blood flow and organs to something less visible but even more influential. Chemistry. Because what you feel after eating is not just about where energy goes. It's also about the signals that tell your body how to behave. Imagine your body not as a machine with switches, but as a system filled with messengers. Tiny molecules moving through your bloodstream, carrying instructions. Not commands in a strict sense, but nudges, suggestions that change probabilities. Slow this down. Speed that up. Store this. Release that. After a meal, the number of these signals increases dramatically. One of the most important players here is insulin. When you eat, especially foods rich in carbohydrates, your blood sugar begins to rise. Your body doesn't allow that to continue unchecked, so it releases insulin. The usual explanation is that insulin helps move sugar out of the blood and into cells. That's true, but incomplete. Insulin also changes the balance of other molecules in your blood, particularly amino acids, the building blocks of proteins. Different amino acids compete with each other to enter the brain. When insulin rises, it causes many of these amino acids to be absorbed into muscles and other tissues, but one of them, tryptophan, is affected less. So, relatively speaking, more tryptophan is left available to cross into the brain. This is where things begin to feel different. Tryptophan is not just another molecule. It is the raw material used to produce serotonin, a chemical often associated with mood, calmness, and a certain kind of mental quiet. When more tryptophan enters the brain, more serotonin can be produced. And serotonin does not sharpen your focus in the way adrenaline does. It softens it. It stabilizes. It reduces urgency. From there, in certain conditions, serotonin can be converted into melatonin, a hormone closely tied to sleep and the regulation of your internal clock. Not necessarily enough to make you fall asleep instantly, but enough to shift your system slightly in that direction. So without any conscious decision, the chemistry of your brain begins to tilt away from alertness and toward rest. Now here's the subtle part. You don't feel molecules moving. You don't feel serotonin increasing. What you feel is the result. A gentle fading of intensity in your thoughts, a reduction in the sharp edges of attention. It's like listening to music that slowly lowers in volume. At no exact moment do you say, now it became quiet. But after a while, you notice the difference. This chemical shift interacts with everything else that's already happening. Changes in blood flow, energy allocation, nervous system activity. It's not one cause, but a layered effect, where each piece reinforces the others. And this is why the experience can vary so much. Different foods trigger different chemical responses. A meal high in simple carbohydrates may produce a stronger insulin spike, leading to a more noticeable shift in amino acid balance and a greater increase in serotonin. A meal rich in protein and fats might lead to a different pattern. Slower and less dramatic. Even the same meal can affect you differently depending on time of day, sleep quality, stress levels, and countless other factors. Because this is not a fixed reaction. It's a dynamic system responding to conditions. What makes it difficult to understand is that your conscious mind only sees the surface. It feels the outcome but not the process. It experiences the effect, but not the chain of events that produced it. So it compresses all of this complexity into a simple statement. I feel sleepy. But behind that simple feeling is a cascade of chemical decisions, each one small on its own, but together shaping the state of your entire mind. And perhaps the strangest part is this. These changes are not happening to you as an external force. They are happening as you. The system that is altering your thoughts is the same system that creates them. There is another layer to this that is easy to miss because you cannot see it and you rarely think about it directly. It has to do with the way your nervous system organizes your entire state. Moment by moment, your body is not always in the same mode. It continuously shifts between different operating states depending on what it believes is most important for survival. These states are not chosen consciously. They emerge from deep, automatic systems that have been shaped over millions of years. One of the simplest ways to understand this is to imagine two broad modes. In one mode, your body is prepared for action. Your senses are sharp. Your attention is outward. Your heart beats a little faster. Your muscles are ready to respond. This is the state you enter when something demands immediate reaction, whether it's danger, competition, or even intense focus on a task. In the other mode, your body turns inward. The urgency fades. Muscles relax. Breathing becomes slower and deeper. Instead of scanning the environment, the system begins to focus on maintenance, repair, and internal processes. This is the state associated with rest and digestion. These two modes are not just different. They are, in many ways, incompatible. You cannot be fully prepared to fight or run while simultaneously dedicating maximum resources to digestion. Trying to do both at full intensity would create conflicts inside the system. Blood would need to be in two places at once. Energy would need to be spent in opposing directions. Signals would interfere with each other. So the body avoids that conflict by shifting clearly from one mode to the other, depending on context. After you eat, the signal is clear. Food has been acquired. Immediate survival, at least in terms of energy intake, is not under threat. This allows the system to move away from high alert mode and toward a state that prioritizes processing what has just been consumed. This shift is not dramatic like flipping a switch. It is gradual, like a dimmer slowly turning. Your heart rate may lower slightly. Your muscles lose a bit of their tension. Even your posture may subtly change without you noticing. The intensity of your attention softens. From the inside, this can feel like a loss of energy or motivation. But from the system's perspective, it is a strategic adjustment. If you pay close attention, you might notice that it is not just sleepiness. It is a different quality of awareness. Your thoughts may wander more easily. You may feel less driven to act and more inclined to sit still. External stimuli feel less urgent, less demanding of immediate response. It is as if your body is saying without words, now is not the time to chase, to fight, or to solve complex external problems. Now is the time to process, to absorb, to rebuild. And this instruction is not coming from your conscious mind. It is coming from a deeper level of organization that operates continuously, whether you notice it or not. What makes this difficult to fully grasp is that you tend to identify yourself with your most alert state. You think of your sharp, focused, outward-facing mind as the real you. So when that state fades even slightly, it feels like something is going wrong. But in reality, that alert state is just one configuration among many. The quieter, slower state after eating is not a malfunction. It is another valid configuration, one that has been selected because in that moment it serves a different purpose. And the more you look at it this way, the more the feeling changes from something frustrating to something revealing. It shows that your experience of being awake is not fixed. It is constantly being tuned by systems that operate below the level of your awareness. You are not simply becoming tired. You are being shifted into a different mode of existence, one where the outside world becomes slightly less important so that something inside you can be completed. Now consider pushing this idea a little further, not just in terms of what happens, but in terms of what would happen if things worked differently. Imagine a version of your body that refused to slow down after eating. You finish a heavy meal, and instead of becoming calm or slightly drowsy, your system stays in a highly alert, activated state. Your heart keeps beating fast. Your attention remains sharp and outward focused. Your muscles stay ready for action as if you might need to run or fight at any moment. At first glance, this might seem like an advantage. You get the energy from food and immediately remain productive, reactive, and mentally sharp. No dip, no slowdown. But now follow the consequences more carefully. If your body stays in that high alert state, blood flow continues to prioritize muscles and the brain regions responsible for rapid response. That means less emphasis on the digestive organs. The stomach may still receive some resources, but not at the level required for optimal breakdown of food. Enzyme production may be less coordinated. The movement of food through the intestines may become less efficient. Digestion is not just about breaking things apart. It requires precise timing, controlled conditions, and coordinated activity across multiple organs. If the system remains in a state of outward urgency, those internal processes become less reliable. So instead of extracting nutrients efficiently, your body might only partially process what you've eaten. Some nutrients would pass through without being absorbed properly. Others might be processed too quickly or too slowly, creating imbalances. Over time, this would become a serious problem. Energy would be wasted. Even though food is entering the body, less of it would actually become usable. In an environment where food is not guaranteed, this inefficiency could mean the difference between survival and failure. There's another issue as well. A constantly activated state is expensive. Keeping your muscles ready, your heart rate elevated, and your brain in a high alert configuration consumes a large amount of energy. If you combine that with the already high cost of digestion, you create a system that is trying to spend heavily in two directions at once. That kind of system doesn't last long. It either exhausts itself or begins to break down in subtle ways. Poor nutrient storage, hormonal imbalances, increased stress on organs that were not designed to operate at maximum intensity all the time. So what seems like a desirable feature, staying fully alert after eating, turns out to be inefficient and potentially harmful when viewed from a deeper perspective. This helps explain why the body evolved the way it did. Instead of trying to maximize everything simultaneously, it sequences its priorities. It allows one set of processes to dominate for a while, then another, depending on what is needed most in that moment. After eating, the priority is clear. Process the incoming material as effectively as possible. That means creating conditions where digestion can operate with minimal interference. It means reducing competing demands from other systems. It means allowing the internal environment to stabilize, rather than remain in a state of constant urgency. From the outside, this appears as a dip in energy or alertness, but from the inside, it is closer to optimization. The system is not becoming weaker. It is choosing not to waste resources on things that are less important at that moment. And this reveals something subtle about how biological systems are designed. They are not built to feel consistently good or energetic from your perspective. They are built to manage trade-offs in a way that maximizes long-term survival, even if that occasionally conflicts with what you would prefer to feel in the short term. So the heaviness you experience is not an error to be fixed. It is the visible result of a deeper logic that values efficiency over constant performance and balance over intensity. Up to this point, it might sound as if the explanation is complete. Energy is redirected, chemistry shifts, the nervous system changes modes, and the result is that familiar heaviness after eating. But there is another layer that makes the picture less clean and far more difficult to fully understand. Because if this were a simple, well-behaved system, the outcome would be predictable every time. The same meal would produce the same feeling, in the same way, with the same intensity. But that's not what happens. Sometimes you eat a large meal and feel extremely slow and sleepy. Other times, a similar meal barely affects you. Occasionally, you might even feel more alert after eating, not less. That inconsistency is not a small detail. It's a clue that something deeper is going on. Your body is not responding to food in isolation. It is responding to food in the context of everything else that is already happening inside you. Consider sleep, for example. If you are already sleep deprived, your system is closer to a threshold where it will shift into a low-energy, restorative mode. In that state, the chemical signals triggered by a meal can more easily push you toward drowsiness. The same signals in a well-rested body may have a much weaker effect. Now think about timing. Your body follows internal cycles, often referred to as circadian rhythms. These cycles influence hormone levels, enzyme activity, body temperature, and even how sensitive your brain is to certain chemicals. Eating the same meal in the morning versus late at night can produce very different experiences. Not because the food changed, but because the system receiving it is in a different state. Then, there is the composition of the meal itself. Foods rich in simple carbohydrates can lead to rapid changes in blood sugar and insulin, creating a stronger shift in the chemical balance we discussed earlier. Meals with more protein, fat, and fiber tend to slow that process down, producing a more gradual response. But even that is not the full story. Inside your digestive system lives an enormous population of microorganisms, trillions of bacteria, each interacting with the food you eat in its own way. These microorganisms are not passive passengers. They actively break down components of your food, produce their own chemical signals, and influence how your body responds. In a sense, when you eat, it is not just you processing the meal. It is an entire ecosystem. Different people have different compositions of these microorganisms, which means the same food can lead to different internal reactions. Some of those reactions can influence how alert or sluggish you feel, though the exact mechanisms are still being studied. And this brings us to an uncomfortable but important point. Even with all the knowledge we have, we are still only seeing part of the system. We can measure blood sugar, we can observe hormone levels, we can identify certain neurotransmitters and trace their pathways. But these are like snapshots of individual pieces, not a complete map of the entire process. The real system is a network of interactions. Feedback loops layered on top of other feedback loops. A small change in one part can ripple through and alter outcomes in ways that are difficult to predict. This is one reason humans struggle to fully explain experiences like post-meal fatigue. The mind prefers simple, linear causes. This leads to that. But the body often operates in nonlinear ways, where multiple factors combine, interfere, and amplify each other. So when you ask, why do I feel this way after eating? The honest answer is not a single sentence. It is a system responding to inputs under specific conditions, shaped by history, environment, internal states, and processes that are still not completely understood. What you feel is real and consistent in its general pattern, but the exact reasons behind each instance are part of a complexity that goes beyond any one explanation. And recognizing that limitation is not a failure of understanding. It is a more accurate view of what you are dealing with. Not a simple mechanism, but a deeply interconnected system that you experience from the inside, without ever seeing it in full. There is something slightly unsettling hidden inside all of this, and it becomes clearer the more closely you look at it. You experience the slowing down after a meal as if it is happening to you. It feels like something external, almost like a force acting on your mind. Your focus fades, your motivation drops, your clarity softens, and yet if you examine it carefully, there is no external force. There is only your own body reorganizing itself. This creates a strange situation. The system that is producing your thoughts is also capable of altering the conditions under which those thoughts occur. It can change the speed, the intensity, even the direction of your thinking, without asking for permission and without informing you in advance. And you only notice it after the fact. This challenges a very common assumption, that you are in control of your internal state. Most of the time, it feels like you decide to focus, decide to act, decide to stay alert. But after a meal, you get a small but clear demonstration that this sense of control is limited. You don't decide to become slower. You don't choose the heaviness behind your eyes. You don't consciously reduce the sharpness of your attention. It simply happens. And then your mind does something interesting. It explains it. It says, I feel sleepy, as if that were an intentional or meaningful description. But in reality, that sentence is more like a label placed on top of a process that is already underway. The explanation comes after the change, not before it. This reveals a deeper structure in how your experience is constructed. Your awareness is not the origin of most processes. It is more like a surface where the results appear. By the time you notice a feeling, the underlying mechanisms that created it have already been in motion. After eating, those mechanisms are particularly visible because the shift is noticeable but not overwhelming. You are still conscious, still thinking, still able to observe the change. It's not like falling asleep instantly, where awareness disappears completely. Instead, it's a gradual transformation that you can watch from the inside, and that makes it a kind of window. A window into the fact that your mental state is not fixed. It is continuously being adjusted by processes that operate outside your awareness. If you extend this idea beyond eating, it becomes even more interesting. Your level of alertness throughout the day, your ability to concentrate, your emotional tone, these are all influenced by similar underlying systems. Hormones rise and fall, chemical balances shift, energy is allocated and reallocated. External conditions interact with internal states. And at each moment, your conscious experience is the result of all these factors combined. But because you only ever experience the final result, it feels unified and self-generated. It feels like you. The post-meal slowdown disrupts that illusion slightly. It shows you that what feels like a stable, self-directed mind is actually something more fluid, more dependent on conditions than it appears. And this is where it becomes difficult for people to fully accept what is happening. There is a tendency to resist the idea that your clarity, your focus, even your sense of self can be influenced so easily by something as simple as eating. It feels too mechanical, too impersonal, but the evidence is right there, repeating itself every day. A meal enters your body, and within minutes to an hour, your entire subjective experience begins to shift, quietly, predictably, and without your consent. And if something that simple can do that, it raises a larger question. How much of what you experience as yourself is actually the result of processes like this, constantly adjusting in the background? Not as a philosophical abstraction, but as a physical reality unfolding inside you, moment by moment, whether you notice it or not. If you follow this idea all the way to its edge, the ordinary experience of eating begins to look very different. A meal is not just something you consume and move on from. It is an event where the boundary between you and the outside world becomes temporarily unstable. What was a moment ago separate, plants, animals, molecules arranged in forms that had nothing to do with your body, begins a process of becoming you. That transformation is not symbolic. It is physical, precise, and unavoidable. The food is broken apart into smaller and smaller components. Those components are absorbed, transported, modified, and eventually incorporated into your cells. Some of them will be burned for immediate energy. Others will be stored. Others will become part of the very structure of your body, your muscles, your blood, even parts of your brain. In that sense, every meal is an act of reconstruction. But reconstruction is not a passive process. It requires coordination, timing, and control. And for that to happen, the system must temporarily reduce distractions from the outside world. This is where the feeling of shutting down takes on a different meaning. It is not that your body is becoming less active. It is that your awareness is being pulled away from the external environment and allowed to fade slightly so that internal processes can proceed without interference. From your perspective, this feels like a loss. Your attention weakens. Your responsiveness drops. The world seems less vivid, less demanding. But from another perspective, something more fundamental is happening. The system is turning inward to perform a transformation that sustains your existence. And this introduces a subtle shift in how you might think about yourself. You are not a fixed object moving through time, occasionally eating to refuel. You are a continuous process, constantly exchanging matter and energy with your environment. The stability you feel, the sense that you are the same person from one moment to the next, is maintained not by stillness but by constant change. The slowdown after eating is one small observable moment in that larger flow. It is a point where the balance shifts inward, where the work of maintaining and rebuilding takes priority over interacting with the outside world. And perhaps the reason this feels so noticeable is that it briefly exposes something that is usually hidden. Most of the time, the processes that keep you alive operate quietly, in the background, without drawing attention. You move, think, react, and it feels as if those abilities are simply there, stable and under your control. But after a meal, that stability wavers slightly. Not enough to disrupt your life, but enough to remind you that what you experience as normal is not a fixed state. It is a temporary configuration maintained by countless processes working together. When those processes shift their priorities, your experience shifts with them. And this leads to a final, slightly uncomfortable but honest realization. What you call yourself is not the central controller of this system. It is more like a surface, a place where the results of deeper processes appear. Eating reveals this in a quiet way. You bring food into your body, and without any conscious effort, a vast internal sequence begins. Energy is redirected, chemistry changes, signals are sent, structures are rebuilt, and your awareness, which feels so central most of the time, steps slightly aside. Not because it is unimportant, but because in that moment something more fundamental is taking place. You are being sustained, reshaped, and continued, not by your decisions, but by a system that operates beneath them. And the brief heaviness you feel is not the system failing. It is the system doing its work. If you sit with this long enough, something subtle begins to change in how you interpret even very ordinary moments. The feeling after a meal is no longer just an inconvenience or a drop in productivity. It becomes a signal, one of the few moments where the deeper structure of your body briefly becomes visible to your awareness. Most of the time, your experience is dominated by outward engagement. You are focused on tasks, conversations, problems, plans. Your attention is directed away from the internal processes that keep everything running. And because those processes remain stable, you rarely question them. They become invisible through consistency. But after eating, that invisibility weakens. You begin to notice that your ability to think sharply is not constant. Your motivation to act is not constant. Even your sense of mental clarity is not something you fully control. It fluctuates, not randomly, but in response to changes happening beneath the surface. And this leads to a deeper question, one that is not easy to answer. If your awareness can be altered so predictably by something as simple as food, then what exactly is the relationship between your body and your mind? It is tempting to think of the mind as something separate, something that uses the body as a tool. But experiences like this suggest the opposite direction may be more accurate, that what you call your mind is deeply dependent on the physical state of your body at every moment. Not just in extreme cases, but in ordinary, everyday situations, a change in blood flow, a shift in chemical balance, a reallocation of energy. These are physical events, yet they shape the way you think, the way you feel, the way you experience reality. So the boundary between physical and mental begins to blur. After a meal, you are not just digesting food. You are, in a very real sense, digesting into a different mental state. Your thoughts slow because the conditions that support fast thinking are reduced. Your attention softens because the system no longer prioritizes external scanning. Your sense of urgency fades because the body is no longer signaling immediate need. And all of this happens without any explicit instruction from you. This is where the difficulty arises. Human intuition prefers to believe in a stable self, a consistent thinker who observes, decides, and acts. But what you see here is something more fluid. The thinker itself is influenced, shaped, and sometimes limited by processes it does not control. And yet, from the inside, it still feels like a single, continuous identity. That tension between the feeling of stability and the reality of constant change is not easy to resolve. It is one of the reasons why explanations like food makes you sleepy persist. They simplify something that is, in truth, far more complex and a bit unsettling. Because if you follow the logic completely, it suggests that your experience of reality is not just something you observe. It is something constructed, moment by moment, from the current state of your body. After eating, that construction shifts slightly. The world feels a bit slower, a bit softer, a bit less demanding. Not because the world itself changed, but because the system generating your experience of it changed. And that leads to a final thought worth holding on to. The next time you feel that familiar heaviness, you can interpret it in two ways. You can see it as a drop in energy, something to resist or ignore. Or you can see it as evidence, quiet, repeatable evidence, that your sense of clarity, control, and awareness is not fixed, but continuously shaped by processes operating just beyond your reach, not as an abstract idea, but as something you can feel happening inside you every single day. If we gather everything together, something very simple and very strange appears at the same time. Every meal you eat is not just nutrition entering a body. It is a full internal reorganization of a living system that has limited energy, limited space, and limited attention. And because those limits always exist, the system must decide what matters most in that moment. After eating, the decision is not complicated. The priority becomes internal processing, breaking down, absorbing, distributing, and storing what has just entered the body. Everything else, especially outward-facing alertness, is temporarily adjusted. From the outside, this looks like a small change. You feel a bit sleepy, a bit slow, a bit less sharp, but from the inside, it is closer to a global shift in operating conditions. The body is not doing one thing. It is reorganizing many things at once, across multiple systems that must remain coordinated. And this is where the deeper idea becomes important. You are used to thinking of yourself as a single, unified observer inside your head. A constant presence that experiences life as it happens. But what this pattern reveals is that the state of that observer is not fixed. It is continuously shaped by the physical condition of the system it depends on. In other words, your experience of being you is not independent of digestion, chemistry, circulation, and energy management. It is emerging from them in real time. This is not a poetic idea. It is a structural one, because if the brain were truly independent of bodily state, then eating would not consistently change how you think or feel. But it does, repeatedly, predictably, across different people, cultures, and situations, with variations that still follow the same general pattern. That consistency tells us something important. The mind is not floating above the body. It is embedded in it. And yet, even knowing this intellectually does not make it easy to fully grasp, because your subjective experience always arrives as a finished product. You do not feel the individual signals, chemical balances, or energy distributions. You only feel the result. Clarity or fog, alertness or heaviness, focus or drift, so your mind naturally builds a simplified story around it. I got tired after eating. I feel full and sleepy. These are useful descriptions, but they are compressions of a much larger process. The reality underneath is not a single cause, but a layered coordination problem. Blood redistribution, hormonal signaling, nervous system switching, metabolic prioritization, microbial activity, all interacting at once, continuously adjusting. And what you experience is the net result of all of it. There is also something more subtle here. The feeling of shutdown is not absolute. You are still conscious, still thinking, still aware. What changes is the quality of that awareness. It becomes less sharp at the edges, less driven toward action, more internally centered. That means the system is not reducing consciousness. It is reshaping its expression. And that distinction matters, because it suggests that what you call being awake is not a single stable state, but a range of configurations your brain-body system can move through depending on context. Eating simply pushes you toward one end of that range. Not toward absence, but toward a different mode of existence, where maintenance and processing take priority over interaction and performance. Seen this way, the post-meal slowdown is not a flaw in the system. It is evidence of how carefully balanced it is. A system that can reallocate itself so quickly, so reliably, and so deeply without breaking is not weak. It is highly optimized for survival in a world where resources are not always guaranteed. And finally, this leads to a quiet but important realization. You do not experience reality directly. You experience the state of a system that is continuously interpreting, adjusting, and constructing that reality based on its internal condition. A meal is one of the simplest ways to see that construction shift in real time. Not because the world changes after you eat, but because the system that lets you experience the world changes first.